Most people think they understand what a tax is. It is something visible, formal, and explicit. A number written on a payslip, a percentage added at the checkout, a bill passed by Parliament, debated on television, and voted on by politicians who can later be punished at the ballot box. Taxes are unpopular precisely because they are obvious. You feel them immediately, and you know who imposed them. Inflation works differently. There is no vote, no announcement that says your purchasing power will be reduced by 7% this year. No line item on your bank statement labeled inflation tax. And yet, for most people, inflation extracts more wealth over a lifetime than income tax ever will. At first glance, inflation looks like a natural phenomenon. Prices go up. That is how the world works. People say, coffee gets more expensive, rent rises, groceries cost more than they used to. This framing is important because it removes human agency from the process. If prices simply rise on their own, then no one is responsible. There is no one to blame, and therefore no one to resist. But inflation is not just prices going up. Prices are a symptom. Inflation, at its core, is the expansion of the money supply relative to the goods and services available in the economy. When more money is created without a corresponding increase in real output, each unit of money buys less than before. That loss of purchasing power is not abstract. It is real, measurable, and permanent. Imagine you work for a year and save $10,000. You do not spend it immediately. You plan to use it in the future, maybe for a home, education, or security. If inflation is 10% that year, your savings did not grow smaller in nominal terms. You still see $10,000 on your bank statement. But in real terms, your savings can now buy what $9,000 could buy a year ago. $1,000 of value has been silently taken from you. No law was passed to take it. No tax authority sent you a letter. And yet, the effect is identical to a 10% tax on your saved labor. This is why inflation is often described as a hidden tax. But that description still understates reality. Inflation is not just hidden. It is structurally superior to traditional taxation from the perspective of the state. It is harder to detect, harder to oppose, and harder to attribute to a specific decision maker. Consider how people react to explicit taxes. When income taxes rise, protests happen. When fuel taxes increase, governments fall. France's Yellow Vest movement began with a fuel tax hike that was trivial compared to long-term purchasing power losses caused by inflation. Yet inflation of similar magnitude often triggers little more than frustration directed at supermarkets or landlords. This misdirection is not accidental. Inflation disperses blame. Rising prices can be blamed on corporations, supply chains, greedy businesses, foreign wars, pandemics, or abstract forces like global conditions. Rarely do people intuitively trace the problem back to monetary expansion itself, because the process is distant, technical, and wrapped in bureaucratic language. Central banks do not say they are taxing the population. They say they are providing liquidity, supporting markets, or ensuring financial stability. Governments do not say they are funding deficits by eroding purchasing power. They say they are stimulating growth or protecting jobs. From the perspective of political survival, this is ideal. Historically, rulers have always sought ways to extract resources from the population with minimal resistance. In ancient times, debasing coinage was a common method. Roman emperors reduced the silver content of coins while keeping their face value the same. Soldiers and citizens received the same number of coins, but those coins bought less. The state paid its expenses with cheaper money, and the cost was spread across the population through higher prices. Modern inflation is a more sophisticated version of the same idea. Instead of clipping coins, governments borrow. Central banks create new money to purchase government debt, either directly or indirectly. The immediate effect is not higher prices at the grocery store. The immediate effect is higher asset prices, lower interest rates, and expanded government spending capacity. The price increases felt by ordinary people come later, when wages lag behind and savings lose value. This delay is critical. A tax that is delayed is a tax that is politically survivable. If a government announced a new 15% tax on savings, the reaction would be explosive. People would move money, protest, and vote against those responsible. But if the same 15% loss occurs gradually over 2 or 3 years through inflation, it is perceived as unfortunate but unavoidable. People tighten their belts, blame the economy, and move on. The efficiency of inflation as a tax lies in the psychological gap. Humans are far more sensitive to losses that are explicit than losses that are diffused over time. Losing $100 to a visible tax feels worse than losing $100 through slightly higher prices spread across hundreds of transactions. Even though the economic effect is the same, the emotional response is not. There is another reason inflation is such a powerful tax. It does not require compliance. Income tax can be avoided, reduced, or optimized. People hire accountants, use loopholes, or move jurisdictions. Inflation cannot be opted out of easily. If you use a national currency, you are exposed. If your wages are paid in it, your labor is priced in it. If your savings are stored in it, your future purchasing power depends on it. This universality makes inflation a tax base unlike any other. It applies to everyone holding currency or currency-denominated claims, regardless of income level. In practice, this makes it regressive. Wealthier individuals tend to hold assets that adjust with inflation, such as real estate, equities, or businesses with pricing power. Lower and middle-income individuals hold a larger share of their wealth in cash, bank deposits, and fixed wages. When inflation rises, the value of money falls first. Wages adjust later, if at all. This means the people least able to absorb the shock are hit first and hardest. Yet because there is no tax bill, the burden is rarely framed as a policy choice. Empirical evidence supports this. Periods of high inflation are consistently associated with declining real wages for lower income workers, while asset owners often see their nominal wealth increase. During the inflationary 1970s in the United States, real wages stagnated while asset prices and government revenues rose. More recently, after large-scale monetary expansion following the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic, asset prices surged long before consumer wages caught up. From the state's perspective, inflation has another advantage. It reduces the real value of existing debt. Governments with large debt loads benefit when inflation exceeds interest rates. A debt of $1 trillion becomes easier to repay if the currency it is denominated in loses value. This is effectively a transfer from savers and bondholders to the issuer of the currency. Again, no vote is required. This is why inflation is not merely a failure of policy or an unfortunate side effect. In many cases, it is the least politically costly way to fund spending, manage debt, and shift economic pain away from the visible mechanisms of taxation. It is taxation without legislation, collection without enforcement, and compliance without consent. And the most remarkable part is that most people do not even realize they are paying it. Inflation does not affect everyone at the same time, and it does not affect everyone in the same way. This is the most important fact to understand if you want to see inflation for what it really is, not a neutral rise in prices, but a mechanism that quietly transfers wealth from some groups to others. If inflation were evenly distributed, it would still be harmful, but it would at least be transparent. In reality, it is neither. When new money is created, it enters the economy at specific points. It does not fall from the sky and land equally in every wallet. It flows through institutions, balance sheets, and political priorities. The people and entities closest to the source of money creation benefit first, while those farthest away pay the price later. This phenomenon is known in economics as the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, who described it in the 18th century. But you do not need economic jargon to understand it. You only need to follow the path of the money. In modern economies, new money typically enters through the financial system. Central banks expand their balance sheets by purchasing government bonds or other financial assets. The sellers of these assets are banks, investment funds, pension funds, and large institutions. These entities receive new money first. At this stage, consumer prices have not yet risen. The recipients of the new money can buy assets, invest, or lend at prices that still reflect the old purchasing power of the currency. This is why inflation often shows up first in asset markets, not in grocery stores. Stock prices rise. Real estate prices surge. Bond yields fall. Those who already own assets see their net worth increase in nominal terms. Those who do not own assets see nothing change yet. And this delay creates the illusion that monetary expansion is harmless or even beneficial. Only later does the new money move into the broader economy. Banks lend. Governments spend. Corporations expand payrolls or buy back shares. Eventually, more money is chasing the same quantity of goods and services. That is when consumer prices begin to rise. But by then, the early recipients have already adjusted their positions. They own assets that reprice upward. They can raise prices, charge higher rents, or renegotiate contracts. The late recipients cannot. Wage earners are almost always at the end of the chain. Salaries are sticky. They adjust slowly through annual reviews, union negotiations, or job changes. During periods of rising inflation, real wages typically fall before they recover, if they recover at all. This lag is not temporary inconvenience. It is the core mechanism through which wealth is transferred. A simple example makes this clear. Suppose inflation rises from 2% to 8% in a year. A business owner who sells products can raise prices within months. A landlord can raise rent at the next lease renewal. An investor sees asset prices increase almost immediately. But a salaried worker earning a fixed wage sees their purchasing power decline in real time, with no automatic adjustment. Even if wages eventually rise, the loss during the adjustment period is permanent. Savings are hit even harder. Cash and bank deposits do not reprice upward at all. If you hold money, inflation directly reduces its value. A 10% inflation rate is equivalent to a 10% tax on cash holdings every year. Unlike income tax, which is applied once per earning period, inflation taxes the same stock of savings repeatedly. This is why inflation punishes prudence. People who delay consumption, save for future, or avoid risk are penalized. People who borrow, spend, or leverage benefit. Debtors repay loans with cheaper money. Creditors receive money worth less than expected. The transfer is not random. It systematically favors those with access to credit and leverage. Historical data makes this pattern clear. During periods of high inflation, real returns on cash and government bonds are often negative, while real assets perform better. In the United States during the 1970s, inflation averaged over 7% per year. Cash holders lost purchasing power every year. Meanwhile, real estate and commodities rose sharply in nominal terms, preserving or increasing real wealth for those who owned them. The same dynamic played out more recently. Following the 2020 pandemic, central banks expanded the money supply at unprecedented rates. In the early phase, consumer prices were relatively stable, but asset prices exploded. Equity markets reached record highs. Housing prices surged in many countries. Those who owned assets saw their wealth increase dramatically. Those who did not were told that inflation was transitory. When consumer inflation eventually arrived, it arrived fast. By that point, wages were already behind, and savings had already been diluted. The wealth transfer had already occurred. Another crucial aspect of this process is that inflation is not evenly felt across goods and services. The prices of financial assets and essential goods tend to rise faster than discretionary items. Housing, healthcare, education, and food often outpace official inflation measures. These are the categories that consume the largest share of lower and middle-income budgets. Even when headline inflation numbers appear moderate, lived inflation can be much higher for those without assets. This creates a statistical illusion. Governments and central banks point to average inflation rates to claim stability, while large segments of the population experience a much sharper decline in purchasing power. Again, no tax bill arrives to explain why life feels more expensive. The transfer remains invisible. Inflation also reshapes behavior. As people realize that holding money is costly, They are pushed toward riskier assets. This is often framed as encouraging investment, but it is also a form of coercion. When safe options are punished, people are forced to take risks they may not understand or want. This benefits financial intermediaries and asset markets, while increasing fragility for individuals. From a distributional standpoint, inflation is deeply regressive. It takes proportionally more from those who live paycheck to paycheck and have little access to financial assets. It rewards those who can borrow cheaply, hold appreciating assets, and pass on higher costs. This is not a side effect. It is a predictable outcome of how new money enters and spreads through the economy. Seen this way, inflation is not just rising prices. It is a system of redistribution that operates without legislation, without transparency, and without consent. The winners rarely call it tax. The losers rarely realize they are paying one. If inflation quietly transfers wealth, the next question is obvious. Why would governments ever choose any other method? From the perspective of political incentives, inflation is not a failure of governance. It is often the least painful option available to policymakers trying to spend more than they can openly tax. Raising explicit taxes is politically dangerous. Tax increases are visible, measurable, and immediate. They show up on paychecks, receipts, and annual statements. Voters understand them instinctively. When taxes rise, approval ratings fall. Elections are lost. History is full of governments that collapsed after pushing taxation too far, even when the fiscal logic was sound. Inflation avoids this problem by separating cause from effect. The decision that creates inflation happens in one place, while the pain shows up somewhere else, much later. A budget deficit is approved today. A central bank expands its balance sheet tomorrow. Prices rise gradually over months or years. By the time households feel the pressure, the original decision makers are often gone, and the chain of responsibility is impossible to trace. This time delay is not incidental. It is the key feature that makes inflation such an attractive tool. Most modern governments operate under chronic fiscal pressure. Voters demand public services, social programs, infrastructure, and crisis support, but they resist paying for them directly. Cutting spending is politically costly. Raising taxes is politically costly. Borrowing seems easier, but borrowing at scale eventually raises interest costs and attracts scrutiny from markets. Inflation offers an escape hatch. When a government runs large deficits, and those deficits are indirectly financed by central bank money creation, the real cost of spending is pushed onto currency holders. Debt remains nominally intact, but its real value erodes. From the state's perspective, this is a partial default without the stigma of default. Bonds are repaid in full, just with cheaper money. This dynamic has repeated throughout history. After major wars, governments are often left with debt levels that would be politically impossible to repay through taxation alone. After World War II, the United States and the United Kingdom both use a combination of moderate inflation and financial repression to reduce debt burdens. Interest rates were held below inflation, ensuring that government liabilities shrank in real terms over time. Savers paid the price, but there was no public debate about a savings tax. In more extreme cases, inflation becomes a primary method of state finance. In post-World War I Germany, massive money creation was used to cover reparations and domestic spending. The result was hyperinflation, which destroyed savings and social trust. While this is an extreme example, the underlying logic was the same. Inflation was easier than explicit taxation in a politically fractured society. Modern policymakers are acutely aware of these lessons. They rarely frame inflation as desirable, but they often tolerate it when the alternative is fiscal austerity or political backlash. Central banks are nominally independent, but their actions consistently align with the fiscal needs of the state, especially during crises. When governments face emergencies, monetary discipline is the first rule to be relaxed. This relationship between fiscal policy and monetary expansion is often disguised by technical language. Quantitative easing, asset purchases, liquidity facilities, and emergency lending programs all sound neutral and temporary. In practice, they expand the money supply and support government financing. The inflationary consequences are treated as secondary or blamed on external shocks. Another reason governments prefer inflation is that it spreads a burden broadly and unevenly. Taxes are targeted. Someone pays. Someone else does not. Inflation applies to all currency users, but in ways that are difficult to quantify. This makes organized resistance almost impossible. There is no single group that can easily say, this policy costs us exactly this much. Inflation also creates short-term illusions of prosperity. Nominal GDP rises. Corporate revenues increase. Asset markets rally. Tax revenues often grow automatically because they are based on nominal values. Governments can claim economic success even as real living standards stagnate or decline. This is especially useful in election cycles, where appearances matter more than long-term outcomes. From an accounting perspective, inflation is remarkably efficient. It increases nominal tax receipts without changing tax rates. A worker pushed into a higher tax bracket by nominal wage increases pays more in taxes, even if their real income has not improved. This phenomenon, known as bracket creep, allows governments to raise revenues silently. Once again, no vote is required. The alternative to inflation is honesty, and honesty is expensive. Admitting that public promises cannot be met without higher taxes or lower spending invites political consequences. Inflation allows governments to delay that reckoning. It buys time, sometimes years, at the cost of long-term trust and stability. This is why inflation tends to follow crises. Wars, financial collapses, pandemics, and systemic shocks create demand for rapid spending. In those moments, the political cost of restraint is higher than the economic cost of inflation. Money creation becomes a path of least resistance. Seen through this lens, inflation is not a mysterious force or an unfortunate accident. It is a policy choice shaped by incentives. It allows governments to do what would otherwise be impossible: spend beyond visible means, manage unsustainable debt, and extract resources without triggering immediate revolt. The question, then, is not why inflation happens. The question is why it does not happen even more often. If inflation functions as a tax, then the final question is not how it works, but who ultimately escapes it and who ends up paying again and again. Over time, inflation does not just reduce purchasing power. It reshapes society. It divides people into two groups: those who understand the game and position themselves to avoid the tax, and those who remain permanently exposed to it. The first group is small but powerful. They hold assets rather than cash. They own businesses with pricing power, real estate with rents that adjust upward, equities that reprice with nominal growth, and debt that shrinks in real terms. Inflation is not an enemy to them. It is a tailwind. Even when inflation creates volatility, it tends to lift nominal asset values faster than wages or savings. The second group is much larger. They live in the currency. Their income comes primarily from wages. Their savings, if they exist at all, sit in cash or bank deposits. They rent rather than own. They consume rather than invest. For them, inflation is not an abstract macroeconomic concept. It is a constant erosion of stability. The divide between these groups widens with each inflationary cycle. Over time, inflation changes incentives. Saving becomes irrational. Holding cash becomes a guaranteed loss. Long-term planning becomes difficult because the future value of money is uncertain. People are pushed toward speculation, leverage, and risk-taking not because they want to be wealthy, but because they are trying not to fall behind. This is not a healthy foundation for a stable society. Inflation also corrodes trust. When people feel that working harder and saving more does not lead to security, belief in fairness erodes. Contracts feel less meaningful. Promises feel temporary. The social contract begins to weaken, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet disillusionment. Historically, prolonged inflation has often preceded political instability, not because prices rose, but because people lost faith in the rules of system. In Weimar Germany, hyperinflation wiped out the middle class's savings, leaving behind resentment and radicalization. In Latin America during the late 20th century, chronic inflation created generations that distrusted local currencies and financial institutions. Even in milder forms, inflation leaves scars that persist long after price stability returns. Those who can protect themselves from inflation often do so by stepping outside the system in subtle ways. They borrow instead of save. They hold assets that cannot be easily inflated away. They structure their lives around ownership rather than income. Over time, these strategies become less accessible to the majority, reinforcing inequality. The cruel irony is that inflation is often justified as a way to protect employment and social stability. In practice, it achieves the opposite in the long run. It concentrates wealth, rewards proximity to power and capital, and punishes those who play by the rules of delayed gratification. And yet, inflation persists not because it is misunderstood by policymakers, but because it is understood too well. It is predictable, it is effective, and most importantly, it is politically survivable. A tax that people can see will be resisted. A tax that people can measure will be debated. A tax that people do not recognize will be endured. Inflation requires no new laws, no parliamentary approval, no public vote. It operates automatically, continuously, and quietly. Every unit of currency loses value, and that loss is redistributed upward through the financial system. The process repeats year after year, cycle after cycle. By the time the public notices, the transfer has already happened. In that sense, inflation is not just the most efficient tax ever invented. It is the most elegant one, invisible to most, unavoidable to many, and endlessly useful to those who control the supply of money.